When a grieving widow faces detectives after her husband's brutal murder, a single slip of the tongue raises their suspicions. She knows more than she's letting on, and the truth could change everything. Make sure to hit the subscribe button so you don't miss any inspiring stories I share. The room felt oppressively cold, its fluorescent lights buzzing faintly as Clara sat at the small metal table. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, the thin sweater she had grabbed in her rush to leave the house doing little to stave off the chill. Across from her, two detectives studied her with an intensity that made her stomach churn. One of them, Detective Graham, leaned forward, his pen hovering over a notebook. His partner, Detective Ruiz, stood by the door, arms crossed, her sharp eyes flickering over every twitch of Clara's face. "Mrs. Lancaster," Graham began, his voice calm but pointed, "we understand you were the one who found your husband's body. Can you walk us through what happened, step by step?" Clara swallowed hard, her voice catching as she tried to begin. I came home around 10:30. I had been at the library, working on a project. James, he wasn't answering his phone, but that wasn't unusual. When I got home, the front door was unlocked. She paused, her eyes darting to Graham's notebook as he jotted something down. I called out to him, she continued, her voice shaking. There was no answer. I went into the kitchen, and that's when I found him. Her breath hitched as she recited the rehearsed words, each syllable carefully chosen to avoid mistakes. But when Detective Ruiz spoke, her tone razor-sharp, Clara felt the ground shift beneath her. "You found him lying in a pool of blood," Ruiz said, narrowing her eyes. "But you also told officers at the scene that you touched nothing, correct? That you ran straight out to call for help." "Yes," Clara said quickly. "I didn't touch anything. I couldn't." Ruiz arched an eyebrow. "Then how did you know the knife was from your kitchen?" The room seemed to still. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she realized her mistake. "I just assumed," she stammered. It must have been. What else would it have been?" Graham leaned forward, his pen still. "It's interesting," he said quietly, "because we haven't mentioned anything about a knife." Clara's heart pounded in her chest. The walls felt closer, the light glaring. She opened her mouth to explain, but no words came. Graham sighed and closed his notebook. "Mrs. Lancaster, you're going to have to do better than that." The room was silent, save for the rhythmic scratching of Detective Graham's pen on paper. Clara's pulse throbbed in her ears as she tried to recover from her slip. She sat straighter in her chair, forcing her face into a mask of confusion and grief. "I don't understand," she murmured. "You think her voice cracked, and she looked down at her trembling hands, a perfect picture of a grieving widow on the verge of breaking. "You're saying I killed him?" "No one's saying that," Ruiz replied, her tone steady but ice-cold. "But it's strange. You didn't touch the body, didn't touch the weapon, yet you knew it was the chef's knife. Care to explain how?" Clara pressed her lips together, shaking her head. "It was an assumption," she whispered. "It's the only knife we keep out on the counter. What else could it have been?" Ruiz didn't respond immediately. She exchanged a glance with Graham, who nodded almost imperceptibly. Then she walked over to the table and leaned down, her face inches from Clara's. "Mrs. Lancaster," Ruiz said, her voice low and deliberate, "you need to stop playing coy with us. We're not here to accuse you of anything, yet. But if you keep withholding information, you're only going to make yourself look worse." Clara blinked rapidly, her breath catching in her throat. "I'm not withholding anything," she said, her voice tinged with desperation. "I told you everything. I came home, and he was," she stopped, pressing her hand to her mouth as if the memory were too painful to recount. Graham broke the silence. "Tell us about your marriage." Clara's head snapped up. "Our marriage?" "Yes," Graham said, flipping to a clean page in his notebook. "You and James. Were you happy?" Clara hesitated, her mind racing. She couldn't deny the truth outright. They'd find out anyway. "We had our ups and downs," she said carefully. "Like any couple. But we loved each other. We were working through things." "What things?" Ruiz pressed. Clara hesitated again. "He'd been distant lately," she admitted. "Spending more time at work. I thought it was just stress." Ruiz crossed her arms. "But it wasn't just stress, was it? He was having an affair." The words hit Clara like a slap, but she kept her composure. Her lips parted, and she stared at the detective with wide, tear-filled eyes. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't you? Ruiz asked, tilting her head. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small plastic evidence bag containing a folded piece of paper. We found this in your husband's wallet. Clara's heart sank as Ruiz slid the bag across the table. Inside was a handwritten note. James, I can't keep doing this unless you leave her. You promised me. If you love me, prove it. The note was signed with a single letter, S. Clara's hands clenched under the table. She forced her voice to tremble as she said, I didn't know. I didn't know he was seeing someone else. Really? Ruiz said, arching an eyebrow. Because we've already spoken to Sophie. She confirmed she was in a relationship with your husband. She also said you knew about the affair and weren't exactly thrilled about it. Clara's jaw tightened. She had suspected Sophie might become part of this investigation, but hearing her name spoken aloud was like nails on a chalkboard. I suspected, Clara admitted quietly. But James swore it was over. I believed him. Ruiz leaned back, studying her. Well, Sophie tells a different story. She says you threatened her. That you told her to stay away from James. Or else. Clara stiffened, her carefully constructed facade threatening to crack. She looked up at Ruiz, her eyes blazing. She's lying, she said firmly. I would never, she stopped, exhaling shakily. I didn't kill my husband, and I certainly didn't threaten anyone. Graham's voice cut through the tension. Then how do you explain knowing so much about the crime scene, Clara? Clara's silence was damning. She looked down, her mind scrambling for an explanation. I just knew, she whispered finally. Ruiz exchanged another look with Graham, her expression unreadable. We're going to take a break, she said. But don't go anywhere, Mrs. Lancaster. We're not finished yet. As the detectives left the room, Clara let out a shaky breath. She knew the real battle was just beginning. The next time the detectives entered the room, they weren't alone. Behind them trailed a young woman with perfectly styled blonde hair and a tailored coat that made her look far too composed for someone involved in murder investigation. Sophie, Clara thought bitterly, her jaw clenching as the woman's name burned into her mind. Detective Ruiz gestured for Sophie to take a seat in the adjacent interrogation room. For a moment, Clara caught Sophie's gaze through the glass wall separating the two rooms. The younger woman's expression was impossible to read, calm, almost indifferent, but her eyes darted away quickly, betraying her nerves. Ruiz and Graham sat across from Clara once more. Graham cleared his throat and leaned forward. Clara, we've just finished speaking with Sophie. She claims she wasn't at your house that night. She says she was at a bar downtown until midnight. Does that match what you know? Clara frowned, her fingers tightening around the hem of her sweater. I wouldn't know, she said, her tone brittle. I don't keep tabs on her. That was more James's department. Ruiz's lips quirked into a smirk. Sophie had a lot to say about you, though. She claims you knew about the affair for months and even confronted her once. She says you made it very clear that James was yours and that you wouldn't let her take him from you. That's not true, Clara snapped, her voice rising. She caught herself and softened her tone. I knew about the affair, yes. James admitted it to me. But I never confronted her. Why would I? My problem was with him, not her. Ruiz shrugged, flipping through her notes. Maybe you wanted to send a message. Sophie seems to think you were ready to fight for your husband, no matter the cost. Clara leaned back in her chair, feigning exasperation. Are you seriously listening to her? Of course she's going to try and blame me. She wants to deflect attention away from herself. The room fell silent, tension thickening in the air. Clara glanced through the glass again, watching Sophie as she twisted her hands in her lap, her calm exterior beginning to crack. Finally, Graham spoke. You mentioned earlier that James was lying in the kitchen when you found him. Do you remember anything else? Maybe hearing voices? Or seeing someone leaving the house? Clara hesitated, her mind racing. She couldn't reveal too much, not yet. But she also knew she needed to steer the detectives in Sophie's direction. I thought I heard something, she said carefully. Footsteps, maybe. But I was too scared to look. I didn't see anyone. Graham's pen hovered over his notebook. Footsteps. Interesting. Ruiz leaned forward. What about Sophie, Clara? Did it ever cross your mind that she might have done this? Clara let her eyes widen slightly, as if the idea had only just occurred to her. I don't know, she said, her voice trembling. But James told me she was unstable, that she wouldn't take no for an answer when he tried to end things. He was scared of her. That's funny, Ruiz said, her smirk returning. Because Sophie told us James was the one who wouldn't let go. She said he promised to leave you, but he never followed through. She also claims he was sending her flowers just last week. Sounds like he wasn't too scared of her. Clara's stomach churned. Sophie was slippery, but Clara knew the truth. She had seen it with her own eyes. She remembered standing in the doorway of the kitchen, frozen in place, as Sophie screamed at James, accusing him of betrayal. She had watched helpless, as Sophie grabbed the knife from the counter and plunged it into James's chest. But she couldn't say any of this. Not yet. Clara forced herself to meet Ruiz's gaze. I don't know what Sophie's told you, but she's lying. I didn't kill my husband. And if you think she's so innocent, maybe you should look a little closer at her. Ruiz studied her for a long moment before standing up. We'll do just that, she said, heading for the door. As the detectives left, Clara caught one last glimpse of Sophie through the glass. The younger woman's composure was crumbling, and Clara knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. She just had to make sure it came out in exactly the right way. The precinct buzzed with quiet activity as Clara sat alone in the interrogation room, staring at her reflection in the one-way mirror. Her mind whirred like a machine, cataloging every word spoken, every glance exchanged, and every step the detectives had taken. She was in control. She had to be. Through the glass, she saw the flicker of movement. Sophie was seated in the adjacent interrogation room, her head bowed, her hands fidgeting in her lap. Clara's lips twitched into the faintest smile. Sophie was cracking. The door opened, and Detective Graham entered with his usual calm demeanor, followed by Detective Ruiz, who had taken off her blazer, revealing the holster at her hip. They looked like two predators closing in, but Clara wasn't prey. Ruiz dropped a file onto the table, its contents spilling slightly, a photo of James's bloodied body, the knife glinting under the harsh kitchen light. Clara didn't flinch. She let her eyes flick over the photo before focusing on Ruiz. You've been holding back, Ruiz said, her voice low and accusatory. And we're done waiting for the truth. Clara tilted her head, feigning confusion. I've told you everything I know. No, Ruiz snapped, leaning forward. You haven't. First, you conveniently knew about the knife. Then, you mentioned hearing footsteps. Now, Sophie is telling us you were more involved in her life than you want to admit. So here's my question. Why were you really at the house that night? Clara's expression shifted slightly, just enough to suggest she was offended. I told you, I came home and found James like that. Why won't you believe me? Ruiz's eyes narrowed. Because something isn't adding up. We've got Sophie claiming you threatened her and your husband, and now we've got you dropping details about the crime scene like you were standing there the whole time. Clara's gaze didn't waver. I was standing there, she said quietly. Graham froze mid-note, his pen hovering above the page. Ruiz raised an eyebrow, her body going rigid. What did you just say? Ruiz asked. Clara exhaled, her hands clutching the edge of the table. I was there, she admitted. I didn't want to tell you because I thought it would make me look guilty. But I didn't kill him. Ruiz's voice turned sharp. You saw the murder happen? Clara nodded slowly. Yes. Graham leaned forward, his tone gentler now. Then tell us what happened. Every detail. Clara closed her eyes, letting the scene replay in her mind. She could still hear the echo of Sophie's voice, trembling with rage, and James's desperate attempts to calm her down. I came home early, she began. I didn't tell James I'd be back so soon. I walked in and heard voices in the kitchen. When I got closer, I realized it was Sophie. She was yelling at James, accusing him of lying to her, of making promises he didn't keep. She paused, her voice catching. I should have gone in. I should have done something. But I was scared. Ruiz crossed her arms. Scared of what? Clara looked up, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Of Sophie. She was unhinged. I could hear it in her voice. James was trying to calm her down, but she wasn't listening. Then, her voice broke, and she pressed a hand to her mouth. Take your time, Graham said softly. Clara nodded, composing herself. Then she grabbed the knife from the counter. She was screaming at him, saying he'd ruined her life. James tried to stop her, but she just She stabbed him. The room fell silent. Graham exchanged a glance with Ruiz, his pen moving furiously across the page. Clara let the weight of her words hang in the air, watching their reactions carefully. "Why didn't you call the police right away?" Ruiz asked finally, her tone skeptical. "I panicked," Clara replied, her voice trembling. "I didn't know what to do. Sophie ran out of the house, and I just froze. I didn't touch him. I didn't touch anything. I thought if I told you what I saw, you'd think I was involved." Ruiz frowned, clearly unconvinced. "So, you just let Sophie walk away? You didn't try to stop her?" "She had the knife," Clara said, her voice rising. "What was I supposed to do? Let her kill me too?" Ruiz opened her mouth to respond, but Graham held up a hand, silencing her. He leaned forward, his eyes locked on Clara's. "Do you have any proof of what you're saying? Anything at all that ties Sophie to the crime?" Clara hesitated, carefully considering her next move. Then, as if reluctantly, she said, "She was wearing gloves. Black leather gloves. When she grabbed the knife, she didn't leave any fingerprints." Graham scribbled this down. "Gloves," he repeated. "Interesting detail. We'll look into it." Ruiz stood abruptly, grabbing the file off the table. "We're going to verify your story," she said, her tone clipped. "Don't go anywhere." As the detectives left the room, Clara slumped back in her chair, exhaling shakily. Her heart was racing, but her mind was calm, methodical. She had given them just enough truth to shift their focus to Sophie without incriminating herself. Through the glass, she saw Sophie pacing now, her movements jerky and frantic. Clara smiled inwardly. Sophie was unraveling, and soon, she'd make a mistake. Hours later, Clara stepped out of the precinct, the evening air cool against her skin. She paused near the entrance, leaning against a lamppost as she lit a cigarette. Moments later, Sophie emerged, escorted by 2 officers. Her face was pale, her eyes wild. Their gazes met briefly, and Clara allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. Sophie's lips parted as if she wanted to say something, but before she could, the officers shoved her into the back of a patrol car. Clara took a long drag of her cigarette and exhaled slowly, watching the car disappear into the night. She had played her part perfectly, and now, the real work was over. James was dead. Sophie was destroyed. And Clara was free. For the first time in months, she felt at peace. Clara stood at her kitchen sink the next morning, staring out the window as the sunlight filtered through the curtains. The house was quiet, almost eerily so. It felt lighter, emptier, free of James and his lies. She sipped her coffee, the bitter taste grounding her. On the counter sat a folded newspaper. The headline read, "Lover arrested in prominent businessman's murder," beneath Sophie's pale, tear-streaked mugshot. The corner of Clara's mouth lifted into a faint, satisfied smile. Everything had gone exactly as she planned. She thought back to that night, her hand tightening around the handle of her mug. Sophie hadn't meant to kill James, not really. But when the argument escalated, Clara saw her opportunity. She had stood in the shadows, silently watching, and when Sophie finally snapped, plunging the knife into James's chest, Clara hadn't lifted a finger to stop it. It wasn't her hand that held the blade. It wasn't her voice that screamed in rage. But it was her silence, her carefully planted seeds of doubt in Sophie's mind, that made everything fall into place. Clara finished her coffee and placed the mug in the sink. She had her freedom, her life back. And she had no regrets. I hope you enjoyed this story. I'm sure you'll also love the next one. Click on the video on the screen right now, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this in the future. Thank you for watching until the end. See you soon.